The night had not yet surrendered to dawn when an unusual stench began to spread through the corridors of the royal palace. Servants who had spent their lives in the service of the Tudor court were no strangers to the smells of medicines, perfumes, or even blood from the occasional injury. But this odor was different. Some whispered it was the bitter aroma of strange ointments. Others suggested it might be the putrefying wound of an unfortunate soldier. But the truth was far more disturbing. The smell came from the body of the most powerful monarch England had ever known. King Henry VIII, the man who had defied Rome, who had reshaped a nation in his own image, who had sent queens to their deaths with a word, was now lying helpless, rotting slowly in his own bed. When senior courtiers entered his chamber that morning, their faces betrayed emotions they had never dared to show. A few pressed scented cloths to their noses, their eyes watering as the foul air clung to their throats. One or two could not control themselves and stumbled out, retching in the corridor, horrified not only by the stench, but by the realization of what it meant. This was not the grandeur of monarchy they had sworn to serve. This was decay, undeniable and merciless, seeping from the very man who had once been the embodiment of authority. The king's body was failing him, and the smell of his death was already in the air. Once, Henry had been the golden prince of Europe. He had towered over men with his commanding frame, a warrior, an athlete, a ruler whose very presence radiated confidence and vitality. Hans Holbein painted him as a figure of dominance, broad-shouldered, richly clothed, a man who filled the space around him with power. But the man lying in the great bed of Whitehall that morning was no longer the Holbein portrait. His legs were ulcerated, oozing with foul fluid. His great bulk, once a symbol of royal feasting and virility, now pinned him down, leaving him unable to rise without help. Even his face, once flushed with the energy of a monarch who hunted and jousted with vigor, was pale, swollen, and marked by the cruel hand of time. Servants exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered prayers. Others silently wondered how it had come to this. How could the ruler of half a century, the terror of nobles, the breaker of 1,000 traditions, end as a helpless invalid whose very presence made the air unbreathable? The truth, though few dared to speak it aloud, was that this final chapter had begun years earlier in a single moment of catastrophe. The king's fall did not start with age alone, but with an accident that shook not only his body, but the very course of English history. On January 24th, 1536, Henry had entered the tilt yard, armored, confident, ready to prove that at 44 he still possessed the vigor of youth. It was to be another demonstration of power, another reminder that the King of England could outshine every knight at his court. But what happened on that field would change him forever. That story, the jousting accident, is one of the pivotal turns in Henry's life, a wound from which he would never fully recover. The consequences were physical, yes, but also psychological, political, and spiritual. They would echo in the marriages that followed, in the executions that darkened his reign, and in the policies that reshaped England itself. As dawn lit the chamber that morning, none of the men gathered could speak openly of the jousting field or the cursed day it all began. They saw only what was before them, a once great monarch trapped in his own decaying flesh. The king's breathing was labored, his body heavy, and his mind wandering between lucidity and pain. Attendants moved carefully, as if afraid to wake some sleeping beast. But Henry no longer inspired the fear he once had. Instead, he provoked something stranger, something more unsettling, pity. Yet even in pity there was fear, for when a king's body fails, the realm itself begins to tremble. Every noble present understood that truth. If the king could no longer stand, if his voice weakened, if his very life was slipping, then the future of England hung in the balance. His death would be more than a personal tragedy, it would be a political earthquake. The courtiers who clutched their handkerchiefs to their faces knew this, even as they struggled against nausea. Some had seen his wrath at its height, the blazing eyes that condemned wives and counselors alike to the block. Others remembered the sound of his laughter, the thunder of hooves as he led the hunt, the glow of torches at feasts where Henry himself commanded the music. All of that was gone now, replaced by silence, by the oppressive odor of decay. by the sight of a monarch who could scarcely turn in his bed. And so the chamber of King Henry VIII on that grim morning was more than a royal bedroom. It was a mirror reflecting the fate of a kingdom. Power, glory, terror, and ambition all had ended in this stifling room, with courtiers choking on the smell of their sovereign. The great Tudor monarch, the master of church and state, was now a prisoner of his failing body. But this was only the beginning of his final descent, the opening of a story that would lead us back to the tilt yard accident and forward to the coffin, where rumors of explosions and leaking fluids would haunt his legacy for centuries. For now, though, the image that endures is this: Henry VIII, once the Lion of Europe, reduced to a man whose very presence made the mighty gag and flee. A king who had defied the Pope, crushed rebellion, and commanded armies, now powerless before the slow, inevitable advance of death itself. This was the dawn of his last days, and the darkest secrets of his final chapter were only beginning to unfold. On January 24th, 1536, the tilt yard at Greenwich Palace was alive with the energy of spectacle. The air rang with the clang of armor, the neighing of horses, and the cheers of spectators who had gathered to watch their king prove, once again, that he was still a warrior of unmatched might. At 44 years old, Henry VIII was no longer the golden youth of his early reign. Yet he entered the jousting arena determined to remind his court and his people that he was still the living embodiment of Tudor strength. He was clad in gleaming armor, mounted upon a powerful destrier, and his confidence radiated across the field. Jousting was more than sport. It was the theater of power, a place where monarchs demonstrated vitality, virility, and command. For Henry, it was also deeply personal. Every tilt was a performance for his nobles, his wives, his enemies at court, and his rivals abroad. Yet fate has a way of striking hardest when pride is greatest. As the king lowered his lance and thundered down the list against his opponent, something went horribly wrong. Accounts differ in detail, but the outcome is consistent. Henry fell. Some said his horse stumbled, others that his opponent's lance struck with brutal force. But what is remembered is that the king was thrown violently to the ground, his massive armored body crashing beneath the weight of both man and beast. For moments that felt eternal, he lay motionless, pinned and silent. Gasps and screams erupted from the crowd. Courtiers rushed to the rails, their faces pale with terror. For if their king was dead, England itself was suddenly without direction. One eyewitness claimed that Henry lay unconscious for more than 2 hours, his courtiers fearing he would never rise again. In those dreadful moments, the future of the Tudor dynasty trembled. This was not just a fall, it was a blow that threatened the stability of a kingdom. When Henry finally regained consciousness, it was as though a shadow had fallen permanently across his reign. He had survived, but he would never be the same. The impact of the accident crushed more than his pride. It crushed his body. His leg, already scarred from an earlier jousting injury years before, suffered new trauma. Deep bruising and possible fractures weakened him, and infections set in that physicians of the 16th century could neither properly treat nor prevent. The ulcers that plagued him in the years that followed traced their origin back to this catastrophe. His once vigorous stride became slower, then halting until he relied on aids to help him move. What had once been the body of a warrior began to turn against him, swelling with painful sores, weakening with every passing year. But the physical wounds were only part of the story. The psychological consequences of the jousting accident were profound. In the wake of his near-death experience, Henry became darker, more suspicious, more volatile. The very month of the accident, his second wife, Anne Boleyn, miscarried a male child. For Henry, this was more than tragedy. It was an omen. Whispers spread that the king believed the accident had signaled God's disfavor, that his union with Anne was cursed. Within months, the marriage that had changed the course of English history began to unravel. The jousting accident had planted seeds of paranoia that would grow into decisions of lethal consequence. In those first hours after the fall, courtiers had seen a glimpse of a world without Henry, and perhaps the king himself had glimpsed it too. The realization shook him. From then on, he seemed haunted by mortality, driven to secure heirs, desperate to prove his dominance even as his body betrayed him. Physicians of the day struggled to treat his injuries. They bled him. They applied poultices. They used ointments whose odors clung to his chambers. But nothing could undo the damage. The leg ulcers became chronic, painful, and dangerously infected. Some modern medical historians suggest the trauma of the fall may have also caused traumatic brain injury, contributing to the mood swings, sudden rages, and erratic decisions that marked his later reign. Whether or not this is provable, what is undeniable is that Henry VIII, after the jousting accident, was a changed man. Gone was the exuberant athlete, replaced by a monarch increasingly confined by his wounds and consumed by suspicion. For his court, the accident was a reminder that
kings, no matter how powerful, were still flesh and blood. The whispered panic of that day never entirely faded. It lingered in the corridors of Greenwich and Whitehall, in the careful glances of courtiers who knew too well that the king's fall had nearly ended more than his own life. It had nearly ended the Tudor line itself. Even decades later, chroniclers would point to January the 24th, 1536 as the turning point, the day when Henry's body began to decay and his reign took a darker, more ruthless path. What began as a tournament to display his vigor instead revealed his fragility, and from that fragility flowed a legacy of fear, cruelty, and suspicion that would define his final years. The tilt yard was supposed to echo with the sound of triumph, but instead, it echoed with the thud of a king brought low, the silence of a crowd staring at death, and the uncertain heartbeat of a nation realizing that its future was more precarious than anyone dared admit. The jousting accident was not simply an injury, it was the fracture line across which the history of Henry VIII in England itself was forever altered.
the jousting accident had left Henry VIII forever altered. And from that moment onward, his body began a slow, relentless collapse that even the finest physicians of his age could not halt. The king who had once been celebrated for his athleticism and vitality now found himself trapped in a body that refused to heal. His leg, brutally damaged by repeated injuries, became the center of his torment. The wound that had been opened in 1536 never truly closed. Instead, it turned into a series of ulcers that festered with infection, sometimes so inflamed that attendants could smell the corruption from across the chamber. These ulcers, deep and chronic, caused agony with every movement, leaving the monarch unable to walk without assistance and frequently bedridden. To treat him, the royal physicians employed the only remedies they knew: bleeding, poultices made from herbs and animal fat, and crude attempts at drainage. They lanced the ulcers to release pus. They smeared on salves whose rancid scents filled the palace, and they wrapped the leg in cloth that quickly became stained and foul. Each treatment was more an act of desperation than of science, and though sometimes the swelling would subside, the relief was temporary. The infection always returned, fiercer than before, and each recurrence left the king weaker. The once mighty warrior now found it difficult even to climb stairs, often needing a pulley system to lift him between floors of the palace. His great banqueting halls, once the stage for his display of power, became places he could rarely visit, for walking even a short distance was torture. He grew heavier as his mobility diminished, his once muscular frame swelling into dangerous obesity. By his final years, he is estimated to have weighed nearly 400 pounds, a burden that placed even more strain on his diseased legs. This physical decline was not just a matter of personal suffering. It became a spectacle that shaped the way his court perceived him. Courtiers whispered about the smell that clung to him, the groans that escaped his lips when he tried to shift in bed, the oozing sores that had to be tended daily. Rumors spread that his physicians had to cauterize the ulcers with hot irons, a treatment as excruciating as it was ineffective. Others claimed the pus would sometimes burst through his bandages during audiences, staining his clothes, shocking those in attendance. For a man who had built his reign on the projection of vigor and dominance, this was a humiliation beyond endurance. Yet Henry refused to appear weak. He demanded that his image as a powerful sovereign be maintained, and so painters still portrayed him as broad-shouldered, regal, commanding, though in reality he could barely stand. His courtiers learned to live in the contradiction, the portrait of the lion-hearted king on the wall, and the broken, wheezing body lying behind the chamber doors. The ulcers were not his only ailment. Many historians believe he also suffered from diabetes, which would have worsened his wounds and made healing nearly impossible. Others suggest he endured gout, contributing to the swelling and pain in his legs. His heart labored under the weight of his body, and his breath grew short with even the smallest exertion. Night after night he lay awake, racked with pain, his attendants changing dressings, applying ointments, whispering prayers. The king who had once ridden across fields at the head of armies now needed help simply to turn over in bed. These physical torments bled into his mind. Constant pain eroded his temper, making him volatile, unpredictable, quick to rage at those who served him. Courtiers approached with trembling hands, fearing that a poorly timed word could send them to the tower or worse. His wives, too, saw the shadow of his decline. Catherine Howard was executed after accusations of infidelity, but many whispered that Henry's inability to consummate the marriage due to his injuries had played a role in his fury. Catherine Parr, his final queen, became more nurse than wife, tending to a man whose body was crumbling before her eyes. The daily rituals of managing his health became almost ceremonial. Servants would carry trays of ointments, rolls of cloth, and bowls of steaming water into his chamber. They would kneel at his bedside, gently peeling away bandages, grimacing as they exposed the raw, infected flesh. Some would dab at the wounds with wine-soaked cloths, hoping the alcohol would cleanse them. Others would apply honey or vinegar, remedies as old as the ancients, but none could restore the king's strength. Each attempt was another reminder of the limits of Tudor medicine and of the mortality of even the most powerful monarch in Europe. The king's personal suffering had political consequences as well. As his body weakened, his reliance on counselors and ministers deepened, but his paranoia grew alongside his pain.
He trusted fewer people, lashed out at perceived betrayals, and tightened his grip on power even as he could barely grip a sword. The fear that radiated from his chamber infected the entire court, creating an atmosphere of dread where whispers of his health became dangerous. To speak too openly of the king's decline was to invite suspicion, even death. And so the court lived in denial, praising his strength while watching him decay. Yet outside the palace, rumors spread unchecked. Ambassadors reported to foreign courts that Henry was gravely ill, that his leg wounds made it impossible for him to appear in public, that the King of England might not live to see another year. These reports weakened his diplomatic position, emboldening rivals who sensed weakness. Henry, aware of these whispers, pushed himself to make public appearances when he could, hiding the agony behind a mask of regal authority, but every step was a reminder of his mortality. The body that had once been his greatest asset had become his greatest liability. In the end, the medical decline of Henry VIII was more than the story of ulcers and obesity. It was the story of a monarch trapped in a prison of flesh, tormented daily by pain, humiliated by decay, and driven to desperation by the knowledge that no physician could save him. His body rotted while he still lived, and that rot seeped into the heart of his reign, the great King of England who had broken the Pope and bent nations. To his will was undone not by armies or assassins, but by infection, disease, and the slow betrayal of his own flesh.
Pain has a way of reshaping the mind, and in the case of Henry VIII, the unending torment of his broken body twisted his once formidable personality into something darker, more unpredictable, and far more dangerous. Before the jousting accident and the festering ulcers, Henry had been known as a man of charisma, capable of laughter, music, poetry, and charm. His court remembered the young king who danced with abandon, who composed songs, who spoke with eloquence and wit. But as pain became his constant companion, the warmth and vibrancy drained away, leaving behind a man who ruled not through inspiration, but through fear. Each day of agony sharpened his temper, making him volatile and suspicious. And the court soon realized that the Henry they now served was no longer the same man who had ascended the throne in a blaze of promise. His paranoia deepened after 1536, and many whispered that the accident had not only damaged his body, but also his mind. The near-death experience, followed by years of chronic suffering, left him haunted by mortality, obsessed with control, and unwilling to forgive even the slightest perceived betrayal. Those who had once enjoyed his confidence now trembled in his presence, for a single frown from the king could mean the loss of favor, fortune, or life. The executions that marked his later reign were not merely political strategies. They were the outbursts of a monarch whose mind had become clouded by suspicion and pain. Thomas Cromwell, the brilliant minister who had engineered Henry's break with Rome, found himself suddenly cast down and beheaded, a victim of the king's shifting moods and relentless need to assert dominance. Queens, too, suffered under this new Henry. Anne Boleyn, once the great passion of his life, was accused of adultery and treason and executed within months of his jousting accident, her fall coinciding eerily with the king's physical decline. Historians debate whether Henry truly believed the charges or whether his obsession with securing a male heir drove him to believe any lie that promised a solution. But what is clear is that his capacity for empathy had withered. Later, Catherine Howard, his young fifth wife, would meet the same fate, accused of unfaithfulness, condemned with the king's characteristic fury, and executed before she had reached 20. Some at court whispered that Henry's failing health, his inability to perform as a husband, and his humiliation at his own decline fueled the rage that consumed these women. Where once he had sought love, now he sought vengeance against anyone who reminded him of weakness. Beyond the marriages and executions, his decisions and governance reflected a man increasingly driven by suspicion. His counselors lived in fear, navigating a maze of shifting loyalties and sudden outbursts. Henry demanded absolute obedience, and those who questioned him were swiftly removed, often violently. The king's court became a theater of terror, where every noble knew that their survival depended not on merit, but on their ability to avoid the monarch's wrath. Yet beneath the surface of cruelty lay the undeniable influence of physical suffering. Chronic pain erodes patience, fosters paranoia, and narrows a person's world until every interaction becomes a test of endurance. Henry's fits of rage were often followed by moments of exhaustion, where he lay drained and silent, staring into the distance as though the weight of his own decline pressed down on his soul. Some chroniclers noted that his eyes grew dark and empty, a reflection of the despair that pain had carved into him. Modern medical speculation suggests traumatic brain injury from the jousting accident may have contributed to mood swings and cognitive changes. But even without modern diagnoses, the evidence of transformation is stark. The king who had once inspired loyalty through charisma now compelled obedience through terror. This psychological shift rippled through every corner of the realm. Foreign ambassadors noted the unpredictability of the English monarch, warning their masters that Henry was both dangerous and unstable. Within England, nobles grew cautious, unwilling to speak their minds lest they provoke destruction. Policies became harsher, punishments swifter, and executions more frequent. Henry's court was no longer a place of Renaissance brilliance, but a stage for fear and survival. And yet, despite the darkness, Henry remained acutely aware of his image. He ordered portraits that showed him as strong and commanding, even as he struggled to walk. He staged appearances designed to mask his frailty, projecting authority while privately consumed by pain. This duality, the image of the invincible monarch and the reality of a broken man, further deepened his psychological torment. He knew the truth of his decay, and he hated it. That hatred spilled onto those around him, especially those closest to his throne.
In his final decade, Henry became the embodiment of absolute monarchy taken to its extremes, suspicious, merciless, and consumed by the need to control every detail of his realm. Where earlier in his reign he had listened to counselors, by the end he trusted almost no one, convinced that betrayal lurked everywhere. His children, too, felt the weight of his changing mind. His daughter Mary, once banished for refusing to recognize his marriage to Anne Boleyn, was restored only after submitting entirely to his will. Elizabeth, Annie's daughter, grew up in the shadow of her mother's execution and her father's wrath, learning caution and silence as survival tools. Edward, his long-desired son, was shielded from his father's decline but carried the burden of a dynasty shaped by fear. In this way, Henry's psychological transformation did not end with him. It shaped the children who would inherit his throne. The England that emerged from his later years was an England scarred by paranoia and cruelty, where subjects had learned that loyalty was never a guarantee of safety. For Henry V, pain had become the lens through which he viewed the world, distorting relationships, magnifying threats, and consuming compassion. His mental and behavioral decline was not a separate tragedy from his physical suffering, but a mirror of it, the mind breaking down as the body decayed. By the time he reached his final years, the once vibrant Renaissance prince was gone, replaced by a tyrant whose cruelty was fueled as much by pain as by power. This was the man who would face death not as a glorious monarch, but as a tormented soul, haunted by the decisions he had made and the bodies that had fallen at his command. When Henry VIII finally breathed his last on January the 28th, 1547, the court that had lived in fear of his temper and power was confronted with a new and unfamiliar terror: what to do with the body of a king whose flesh had been rotting long before his death. The physical condition of Henry in his final days made the rituals of burial far more complicated than they had been for his predecessors. Normally, the passing of a monarch was an opportunity for grandeur, for pageantry, for a carefully orchestrated display of continuity and majesty. But in Henry's case, beneath the trappings of royal ceremony lay a grim reality that no amount of incense or chanting could disguise. His body was a source of dread. Courtiers and physicians knew that decomposition had already advanced. Chronic infection, obesity, and ulcerated flesh had left his corpse unstable, volatile, and dangerous to handle. Embalming in the Tudor period was primitive by modern standards. The process relied on spices, wine, and crude surgical procedures, not on the scientific preservation we know today. When his body was prepared, attendants attempted to drain fluids and seal the wounds, packing his abdomen with substances meant to slow decay. The coffin was lined with lead, heavy and imposing, both a symbol of his might and a desperate attempt to contain what lay within. Yet even with these measures, rumors quickly spread that the corpse of Henry VIII resisted containment. Chroniclers later wrote that as the coffin lay in Sion Abbey overnight during the journey to Windsor, the lead casing cracked under the pressure of gases from the decomposing body. From that crack, fluid seeped onto the floor. In one of the most infamous legends of Tudor lore, dogs were said to have licked at the seepage, an image so shocking and grotesque that it was remembered for generations as divine judgment upon a tyrant king. Whether the story is entirely true or a sensational embellishment, it captured the imagination of contemporaries and later historians alike, for it symbolized the collapse of earthly power before the inevitability of death. Even if no dog ever entered that chamber, the fact that the rumor thrived reveals how people viewed Henry's legacy, not only as a monarch of power and grandeur, but as a man whose body and spirit were corrupted by cruelty and excess. The funeral itself was, at least on the surface, a grand affair. Draped in cloth of gold and accompanied by solemn processions, the king's coffin was carried with all the pomp expected of England's ruler. Heralds proclaimed his titles, choirs sang requiems, and nobles in mourning garb bowed their heads. But those closest to the body knew the reality hidden beneath the spectacle. They could smell it, they could sense it, and they carried with them the knowledge that this was not the serene passing of a revered sovereign, but the hurried management of a corpse too unstable to control. At Windsor, Henry was interred in St. George's Chapel, the sacred resting place of kings, in a vault that he had intended to hold a magnificent monument. Plans had been drawn up for a tomb that would rival the greatest sepulchres of Europe, adorned with gilded effigies and elaborate carvings, a lasting statement of his authority. But that monument was never built. Financial strain, political upheaval, and neglect left the tomb incomplete. Instead, Henry lay in a modest vault, sharing it with Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his only legitimate son, Edward. For all his grandeur in life, in death he was reduced to a simplicity that mocked his ambitions. The absence of a glorious tomb was more than a practical oversight. It was a reflection of a reign that had promised magnificence yet left behind turmoil. The stories of his body's corruption spread quickly across Europe, carried by ambassadors and chroniclers who had long documented Henry's excesses. To his enemies, it was proof that God had punished him. To his subjects, it was a warning of mortality, a reminder that even the most powerful king could not escape decay. In pulpits and whispered conversations, the tale of the exploding coffin at Sion Abbey became a parable of pride brought low. Some saw it as poetic justice. The man who had executed wives, destroyed monasteries, and defied the Pope now lay in disgrace, his corpse betraying the illusion of invincibility. Others, however, mourned sincerely, remembering the young, vigorous king who had once inspired hope and awe. Yet the dominant narrative was one of corruption, both physical and moral, embodied in the leaking coffin. Tudor funerals were meant to reinforce dynastic legitimacy, to project stability into the future. In Henry's case, the pageantry clashed with the reality of decomposition. Behind the banners and hymns was the unsettling truth that the dynasty was fragile. His heir, a sickly boy of 9, his daughters still disputed in legitimacy, his kingdom divided by religion and fear. Thus the funeral procession, no matter how splendid, carried with it the stench of uncertainty. The embalming rituals, the sealing of the coffin, the careful choreography of ceremony, all of it was an attempt to mask a deeper rot, one that was not only in Henry's body but in the kingdom he left behind. And yet the stories endure. Centuries later, visitors to St. George's Chapel still pause at the site of Henry's vault, where no grand monument marks his resting place. They recall the legend of Sion, the leaking coffin, the dogs licking the floor, and they see in it a metaphor for the fall of pride. It is this image, more than the hymns or the heralds, that defines his burial in the memory of history. The king who had reshaped England in life was reduced to rumor and decay in death, his body an object of horror rather than reverence. And so Henry VII's burial became part of his legacy, inseparable from his reign. It was not only the end of a life, but the beginning of a legend, a cautionary tale told across generations that no power, no wealth, no decree can preserve the flesh of a man who built his empire on cruelty and excess. His coffin, heavy with lead yet unable to contain him, became the final symbol of a monarch whose body and reign had both collapsed under their own weight. The death of Henry VI did not end his story. In many ways, it only deepened the fascination that surrounded him, for what followed was not simply history but legend, a mingling of fact and rumor that blurred the line between truth and myth. The grotesque tales of his coffin leaking, of dogs licking at the fluids, of an explosion within the lead casing that sent pieces of the Monarchs' romance spilling out, became part of the narrative almost immediately, repeated by chroniclers who may have been less concerned with accuracy than with symbolism. These stories painted Henry's demise as divine retribution, as though God himself had judged the tyrant king and allowed his body to betray him even in death. But how much of it was true? Historians have wrestled with this question for centuries, sifting through accounts written by those who hated him, those who revered him, and those who sought to moralize his life as a cautionary tale. The reality is more complicated than the myth. It is certainly possible that Henry's coffin, despite being lined with lead, failed under the pressure of decomposition gases. Such failures were not uncommon in the 16th century, when embalming was rudimentary and refrigeration non-existent. The sheer size of Henry's body, swollen with obesity and riddled with infection, would have made his corpse particularly prone to such eruptions. But whether fluids truly seeped out at Sion Abbey and whether dogs entered to lick at them remains unproven. What we can say with confidence is that the story was widely believed and repeated, and in that belief lies a kind of truth about how people saw their king. To many, Henry had been a monster, a man who executed wives, destroyed monasteries, and ruled with cruelty. The image of his body bursting apart was, to them, fitting justice, a final humiliation for a man who had humiliated so many others. In Sermons and Chronicles, the tale was told as a moral lesson, the mighty brought low, the tyrant consumed by his own corruption, yet not all rumors were so grotesque. Some claim that in his final days, Henry showed remorse, that he whispered confessions of sin and sought forgiveness. Others said he was defiant until the end, refusing to repent, convinced of his own righteousness. These contradictory accounts reflect more about the storytellers than about the king himself. Catholic writers hostile to the monarch who had broken with Rome emphasized his corruption and damnation. Protestant sympathizers, eager to preserve the image of a reforming king, suggested he died reconciled to God. The truth is probably less dramatic. Henry, racked with pain and fading in strength, may have uttered fragmented words of fear or faith, but the exact nature of his final thoughts remains unknown. What endures are the stories, shaped by the needs of those who told them. Rumors also surrounded the embalming itself. Some said that the physicians, overwhelmed by the state of his body, abandoned the task halfway, leaving his corpse improperly treated. Others claimed that elaborate efforts were made, using exotic spices and quantities of alcohol, but that the body's corruption was too great to overcome. Neither version can be proven, though both capture the sense of helplessness that must have pervaded the chamber where his remains were prepared. More myths grew in the years that followed. One held that Henry had been buried not in Windsor but secretly elsewhere to hide the shame of his decaying body. Another insisted that his ghost haunted the corridors of Whitehall, dragging his ulcerated leg and filling the air with the same stench that had once sickened his courtiers. These tales, of course, belong more to folklore than to history, yet their persistence speaks to the impression Henry left on those who lived after him. He was too large a figure, too terrifying, too transformative to fade quietly into the earth. People needed stories to make sense of him, to contain the enormity of his reign and the brutality of his personality. Myths became a way of explaining the inexplicable, how a man who had once been the Golden Prince of Europe could end as a bloated, broken tyrant. Even the question of his soul was wrapped in rumor. Some said his spirit was damned, condemned to eternal torment for his cruelty. Others believed his soul was redeemed by the reforms he championed, by the break with Rome that paved the way for the English Church. In truth, Henry's soul, like his body, became a canvas on which others painted their fears and hopes. The rumors, whether of exploding coffins or whispered prayers, reveal less about what happened than about what people needed to believe. And that, in itself, is the essence of history as it is remembered, not just what occurred, but how it was told. Separating myth from evidence requires us to look at the sources critically. Chroniclers like Edward Hall and later writers often wrote with agendas shaping Henry's image to serve moral or political ends. Modern historians emphasize the lack of concrete proof for the more sensational tales, yet they also acknowledge that such stories, even if false, had real impact. They shaped how people thought of Henry, how they interpreted his reign, and how they understood the dangers of unchecked power. The myths became part of the truth, not in the sense of factual accuracy, but in the sense of cultural memory. For Henry V, perhaps more than any other English monarch, legend and reality are inseparably intertwined. The bloated corpse that may or may not have exploded, the ghost that may or may not have haunted Whitehall, the last words that may or may not have sought forgiveness. All of these stories reveal the same truth, that Henry VI was too powerful, too feared, too despised, and too fascinating to be remembered in silence. His end had to be larger than life, just as his reign had been. And so the rumors live on, told and retold, each generation deciding for itself whether to see in them justice, tragedy, or warning. In the end, the myths of Henry V are not distractions from history, they are part of it. The echoes of a reign so immense that it still demands explanation centuries after his death. To understand the decline of Henry VI, one must also understand the world of medicine in which he lived, a world defined not by scientific precision, but by tradition, superstition, and the limited knowledge of the human body that the 16th century could provide. In Tudor England, physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries operated in an uneasy hierarchy. The learned physicians, often university-trained and proud of their Latin, believed illness stemmed from imbalances of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And their treatments aimed to restore harmony through bleeding, purging, or diet. Surgeons ranked lower, in prestige, and often associated with barbers, handled wounds, amputations, and the gruesome work of tending to injuries on the battlefield. Apothecaries compounded medicines from herbs, minerals, and animal parts, selling remedies that blended genuine therapeutic effects with pure folklore. Into this world of imperfect knowledge came the royal patient and Henry VII's body posed challenges that exceeded their skills. When his ulcers erupted, the treatments were medieval in practice, lancing the sores with crude knives, cauterizing with heated irons, or applying poultices of honey, vinegar, or animal fat. Wine was poured into wounds as an antiseptic, though without understanding of bacteria, success was sporadic. Bandages were applied, often so tightly they cut off circulation, and the smell of rot lingered no matter how much incense was burned. Physicians could do little but watch as infection returned again and again, each time stronger, each time leaving the king weaker. For pain, remedies ranged from herbal concoctions to opiates imported at high cost, but their effects were temporary and often dulled the mind as much as the body. The Tudor understanding of obesity was equally limited. Gluttony was often seen as a moral failing rather than a medical condition, and few connected Henry's diet of red meat, pastries, and ale to the strain on his failing body. Exercise was prescribed in theory, but the king's injuries left him unable to move freely, creating a vicious cycle of weight gain and worsening health. In this environment, Henry's physicians could not offer cure, only ritual. They attended him with ceremony, presenting their treatments. Centuries after Henry VIII was lowered into the vault at St. George's Chapel, his body long since turned to dust, the mystery of his health continues to fascinate scholars, doctors, and historians who try to piece together from fragments of evidence what exactly destroyed the once magnificent king. The sources we have are incomplete, scattered across ambassadorial letters, physicians' notes, and the observations of courtiers who often wrote with their own agendas. Yet from this patchwork of documents, modern experts have built a series of theories, each attempting to explain the physical and psychological collapse of England's most infamous monarch. Some point first and foremost to the jousting accident of 1536, arguing that the trauma not only crippled his leg but also caused a traumatic brain injury. The sudden changes in his personality, his rages, his paranoia, his impulsive cruelty are consistent, they suggest, with damage to the frontal lobe. Had he lived in the modern world, Henry might have been diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury and treated with therapies to manage his moods. Instead, he was left to spiral into suspicion and violence, unchecked by any understanding of what was happening inside his skull. Others believe the answer lies in metabolic disease, Henry's rapid weight gain after his injuries, his ulcerated legs, and his apparent difficulty healing wounds point many doctors toward diabetes, particularly type EI, which would have worsened every other condition. Diabetes would explain the slow healing, the repeated infections, and even the lethargy that marked his later years. Combined with his rich diet and limited mobility, the disease could have consumed him from within, accelerating his decline long before death finally claimed him. Gout is another frequent suspect, known as the disease of kings for its association with rich diets. Gout causes excruciating pain in the joints, particularly the feet and legs. Chroniclers noted Henry's struggles to move, his swelling, his inability to ride or walk without aid, all of which are consistent with severe gout. When layered on top of ulcers and infections, the agony would have been unbearable, turning every step into torture. Some modern researchers go further, suggesting Henry may have suffered from Cushing's syndrome, a hormonal disorder caused by excessive cortisol. Symptoms include obesity centered on the trunk, mood swings, and weakness in the limbs, all traits seen in Henry's later life. Still others point to syphilis, the disease often associated with monarchs of the age, though the evidence here is thin. Despite popular rumor, Henry shows little of the clear neurological or skeletal symptoms that syphilis would have produced in advanced stages. Modern scholarship tends to dismiss this diagnosis as sensational rather than supported. What unites all these theories is a recognition that Henry's decline was multifactorial. It was not one disease, but a convergence of many: traumatic injury, obesity, infection, possible metabolic disorder, and the mental strain of chronic pain. Together, they created a spiral of deterioration that no physician of the 16th century could possibly have managed. Beyond the physical, historians also analyzed the psychological impact of his condition. Was Henry naturally cruel, or did pain drive him to become a tyrant? The young king had been charming, generous, and beloved. The older king was feared, suspicious, and brutal. The transformation suggests that physical suffering and perhaps brain trauma shaped his politics as much as ambition did. In this view, history itself was altered by a medical accident, with the fate of wives, ministers, and even nations influenced by the damage done in a tilt yard. Experts also debate his final days. Some accounts claim he confessed his sins and sought God's mercy. Others argue he died unrepentant, convinced of his own righteousness. The lack of reliable eyewitness testimony makes it impossible to know. But the very debate reveals the enduring fascination with Henry's end. It is not enough to know what he did. We want to know what he thought, what he felt, what haunted him in those last moments. Modern technology has been brought to bear on the mystery as well. Studies of surviving artifacts, such as his armor, reveal the extraordinary expansion of his waistline over time, providing physical evidence of his obesity. Analysis of portraits, combined with written descriptions, helps track the progression of his illnesses. Some have even proposed exhumation and forensic analysis, though this has never been done, leaving the mystery tantalizingly unresolved. The conflicting opinions reflect the broader truth about history. Evidence is limited, and interpretation fills the gaps. Catholic writers emphasize divine punishment. Protestant historians framed his decline as human frailty. Modern doctors see disease. Each perspective tells us as much about the observer as about the king himself. The contradictions are unlikely ever to be resolved fully, but that is part of what keeps Henry VI alive in the imagination. He is not simply a figure of the past, but a puzzle that demands constant re-examination. In the end, perhaps the most accurate diagnosis is the simplest. Henry VI was a man of flesh and blood, subject to the same vulnerabilities as any other. His power could not shield him from infection, his wealth could not buy him a cure, and his will could not overcome the failures of his body. The fascination of experts lies in this paradox. How could a man so mighty be brought so low? How could the Lion of England become a prisoner of his own decaying flesh? Each theory, whether brain injury, diabetes, gout, or hormonal disorder, is an attempt to answer that question. None is conclusive, but together they form a portrait of decline that is both tragic and human. The arguments will continue, because Henry VI is too large a figure, too central to history, to rest quietly in his grave. His life, his reign, and his body remain subjects of debate, and each new generation of scholars adds its voice to the chorus. What is certain is that his end, however explained, reveals a universal truth that no power, no title, no throne can protect a man from the frailties of the human body. And in that truth lies the enduring lesson of Henry VI, a lesson written not in law or conquest, but in flesh, infection, and death.
When Henry VIII died in January 1547, the body that had once terrified courtiers and defined an era was finally gone. But the shadow he cast over England remained immense, and the impact of his reign continued to shape the kingdom long after his coffin was lowered into the vault at St. George's Chapel. His legacy was not only political but personal, written into the lives of his children, the structures of his government, the church he had torn from Rome, and the very culture of fear he had cultivated. His 9-year-old son, Edward VI, inherited the throne, a boy too young to rule and therefore subject to the control of regents who imposed Protestant reforms that pushed the English church further from Catholicism. Edward's fragile health and early death only deepened the uncertainty Henry left behind, proving that the obsession with securing a male heir, a drive that had cost wives their lives and kingdoms their peace, had yielded only a temporary solution. Mary I, Henry's eldest daughter, took the crown after Edward and sought to restore Catholicism, earning the name Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants. Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, followed, and under her reign England entered a golden age, a bitter irony considering that her mother had been condemned to death by the same father whose dynasty she now glorified. In this way, Henry's choices reverberated across generations, each child carrying the burden of his decisions, each reign a commentary on his own. Beyond succession, his impact was carved into the very structure of English government. By declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England, Henry had permanently altered the balance of power between crown and church. The monasteries he dissolved, their lands seized and redistributed, reshaped the economy and the aristocracy, creating a new class of nobles loyal to the crown's favor. Yet this also left scars, centuries of tension between Catholics and Protestants, a legacy of division that outlived him by far. Politically, Henry's reign demonstrated the extremes of absolute monarchy, where the will of one man could alter the faith of a nation, erase centuries of tradition, and decide the lives of queens and ministers alike. The fear he instilled in his court did not vanish with his death. It lingered in the political culture of Tudor England, where survival often depended on silence and obedience. His ministers, even after his passing, continued to operate in the shadow of his ruthlessness, wary of defiance, trained by years of terror to bend to the sovereign's will. The people of England, too, carried conflicting memories. To some, Henry was the majestic king of Holbein's portraits, the embodiment of royal power and national pride. To others, he was the bloated tyrant whose cruelty brought suffering and whose policies sowed division. The legends of his rotting corpse, the leaking coffin, and the dogs at Sion Abbey became symbols of divine justice, ensuring that for many, his end was seen as a punishment befitting his sins. Abroad, his legacy was equally complex. To Catholic Europe, he was the king who had defied the Pope, the heretic who had dragged England into schism. To Protestant states, he was both a pioneer and a warning, a ruler whose personal obsessions, rather than true faith, had sparked reform. His reputation as a despot made allies cautious and enemies bold. And even after his death, ambassadors wrote of him with a mixture of awe and disgust. Culturally, his reign left indelible marks. The English Renaissance flourished under his patronage of music, art, and architecture, yet it was always overshadowed by the brutality of his court. The Tower of London, where wives and nobles were imprisoned and executed at his command, stood as a grim monument to his paranoia. St. George's Chapel, where his remains lay without the grand monument he had planned, symbolized both his ambition and his failure. His legacy was not one of peace or stability, but of upheaval, transformation, and fear. And yet, in that turmoil, he achieved something lasting. He ensured that the Tudor dynasty would dominate the 16th century, and he set England on a path that would eventually lead to global power under Elizabeth. It is this paradox that defines Henry VIII's legacy, a man whose cruelty nearly consumed his kingdom, but whose boldness created the conditions for its rise. His death did not free England from his influence. It left the nation entangled in the consequences of his reign. Every decision he made, every marriage, every execution, every policy echoed into the future, shaping the character of a realm that would struggle with the weight of his choices for generations. Even today, Henry remains both fascination and warning. His story is told not only as history, but as his legacy was not peace but unrest, not stability but transformation, not mercy but fear. And that legacy, more than his conquests or his laws, is what defined the realm after
the end. When we gather together the fragments of evidence, the whispers of rumor, the accounts of chroniclers, and the analysis of modern experts, what emerges is not a single, simple truth about Henry VIII's final days, but a tapestry woven of pain, power, decay, and legend. The strongest truths are those that cannot be denied. He was once a vibrant prince whose charisma and strength dazzled Europe. He suffered a catastrophic jousting accident in 1536 that left him permanently crippled and possibly altered his mind. He endured years of agony from ulcerated legs, obesity, and infection. And he ruled in his later years with a paranoia and cruelty sharpened by constant suffering. These facts stand firm, supported by records, portraits, and testimony. Around them swirled the shadows of myth, the tales of exploding coffins, of dogs lapping at royal remains, of whispered confessions or stubborn defiance at the moment of death. Whether true or not, these stories became part of his legacy because they satisfied the need to see in Henry's end a reflection of his reign. To those who hated him, the image of his body rotting, his coffin failing, was divine justice, the tyrant undone by the very flesh he had so indulgently fed. To others, the thought of a king seeking forgiveness in his last breath offered hope that even the cruelest ruler might find redemption. Between these extremes lies the mystery that will never be solved, for the silence of the grave keeps its secrets well. Yet the lesson of Henry's final days does not depend on proving or disproving every rumor. It lies in the undeniable contrast between the man he was and the man he became. The young Henry, handsome, athletic, brilliant, inspired loyalty and admiration. The older Henry, swollen with disease, tormented by pain, and consumed by suspicion, ruled through terror and left his court trembling. His decline was not only the collapse of a body, but the collapse of an ideal, the shattering of the Renaissance dream of a perfect prince. It is here that his story carries its greatest weight. For Henry's end reminds us of the fragility of power, of how even the mightiest monarch can be brought low by the same frailties that afflict every human being. His throne, his wealth, his armies, his defiance of the Pope, all of it could not save him from ulcers, infection, and decay. His grandeur could not stop the smell of rot that drove courtiers from his chamber. His laws could not silence the gossip of Europe about his leaking coffin. His will could not preserve his body from bursting apart in rumor and in memory. The final lesson is stark. Mortality is the great equalizer, and no man, not even Henry VIII, could escape it. And yet, his death was not only the end of one life, it was the pivot of a nation. The England that emerged from his reign was forever changed. The church he created, the monarchy he reshaped, the children who inherited his throne all bore the mark of his decline. His story is therefore not just a biography, but a warning that when power becomes absolute, when cruelty becomes habitual, when personal obsessions override the common good, the consequences outlive the man. They seep into the institutions, the culture, the memory of a people. Henry's last days, filled with pain, rumor, and decay, were not separate from his reign, but its culmination, the physical embodiment of the corruption and fear he had sown. That is why his end still fascinates us, still horrifies us, still compels us to retell it. It is not simply the story of a king dying. It is the story of power itself, stripped bare and revealed as mortal, in the silent vault of St. George's Chapel, where he lies without the grand monument he once planned. Henry VIII remains a presence larger than life. Visitor pause at the stone slab, aware that beneath it rests not only a body but a legend. They recall the golden prince who became a tyrant, the mighty king who rotted while still alive, the monarch whose final days were as horrific as any chapter of his rule. And in that pause, in that memory, lies the enduring lesson that greatness without mercy, power without restraint, and indulgence without wisdom lead not to glory but to ruin. Henry VIII wanted to be remembered as the most powerful king England ever knew. In that, he succeeded. But history remembers also his ulcers, his rages, his paranoia, and his decaying corpse. The darkest secrets of his final days are therefore not secrets at all. They are warnings etched into the fabric of history, telling us that no crown, no empire, no ambition can protect a man from the justice of time.